Hi there, Smart Drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test talking to you today about working for MacArthur Express, hauling office furniture for Steelcase into the United States, mostly up and down the eastern seaboard, and as well working for a personnel agency. And this is another opportunity for CDL drivers who are having some challenges getting work as a truck or bus driver. This could be one of the options for you. So stick around. We'll be right back with that part of the story. And that didn't work at all. I'm supposed to roll into the intro, but the intro didn't work out because it's weird. I've got it. I don't have it on my hard drive on my computer. I have it on an external hard drive, and as soon as I clicked the button, it had to spool up, which is frustrating. But anyway, that's part of tech, and that's what we're here. So we're on day 6 of story time of talking about CDL stories and my driving career and how I became a commercial driving instructor, a licensed driving instructor, and talking to you about that. Day 6 of the lockdown. We're still in lockdown. We probably will be, I suspect, until the end of the month. So if you're here, leave us a comment, hit that thumbs up button, consider subscribing to the channel, because Smart Drive Test, the YouTube channel, I have learned as part of the lockdown and the COVID-19 virus that this channel, my business, is hinged to the opening of the DMV test centers, and maybe that was a good thing, maybe not a good thing. But essentially, Smart Drive Test right now is on life support. The channel, just as soon as everybody started locking down, the channel just went, and it's pretty serious right now. So anyway, life has a way of working out. We have a way of learning new things, figuring out new things. Carrie here is from Minnesota. She's here. Awesome. So today, what I want to talk about a little bit is I just want to talk a little bit about some of the rookie mistakes that I made when I first started learning how to drive truck. And the reason that I want to talk about some of the rookie mistakes that I made was that hopefully it will kind of give you a bit of direction in terms of your own CDL career, and keep you safe on the road if you decide that you're going to be a truck or bus driver, because I did make a lot of mistakes. Because as I said, when I got my CDL license, what I was saying to you was that I didn't go to truck driving school. I didn't get the leadership and mentorship from other drivers who had been in the industry, and I learned a lot of it on my own. And so I kind of want to go through that list. I wrote down a few things here, and I'll go through that list, and hopefully that'll help you out. Frederick is here, ready for dinner in Denmark. Frederick, I think that Denmark's in the Greenwich Mean Time zone, isn't it? Or 1 hour off kind of thing. You're around 6 or 7 o'clock at night. Janet is here from Ontario, Canada. Awesome. That's my home province. So lots of people here. So a couple of things, just going back to team driving, and one of the reasons that I wouldn't ever go back to team driving or counsel you to do team driving is that, as I said, two men's egos will not fit in the size of in the cab of a semi truck. And I fell asleep twice while I was driving truck, driving team. Fortunately, nothing ever came of it. I do believe in guardian angels, and I think my guardian angels were looking after me. And the reason that I fell asleep was, I'm young. I was young. I was in my 20s at the time when I was driving truck. And the thing is that you had to drive 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 4 hours on, and 4 hours off. And that's just not possible. That is simply not possible. Just the way we're designed biologically. You're in the middle of the night. You come on shift, say at 10 o'clock at night, and you got to drive for 4 hours from 10 till 2 o'clock, 2 a.m. And there's times that you just start dozing off at the wheel, and you're not going to wake the other guy up. So you somehow have to push through that. I mean, and you can pull over and you can stop and run around the truck and eat and all these things. And all of these, I did learn how to do all of this stuff, right? I did learn how to manage fatigue later on and how to keep myself awake. But when I was young and I first started driving truck, I had no idea how to stay awake. So Ben is here from France. Wheelman is from Portugal. My friend Wheelman. What's my favorite truck? It depends on it depends, Wheelman, what you want your truck to do. Truck that you want to live in, and get fuel economy, or a pretty truck like Kenworth, Peterbilt 379. I mean, I love Peterbilt 379s. I mean, they're just a very cool looking truck with stacks on them and those types of things. But to live in, probably a Volvo. They're just the nicest truck to live in terms of the bunk and whatnot. But definitely not those big Kenworths and those types of things. So Katie's here as well, and Ben from France and Portugal. Awesome. So that's really great. So we got people from all over the world. So this 11 a.m. thing is starting to work out for us. So the first time I fell asleep driving team in the truck, we were running down to the border, and I fell asleep on the way into Windsor. Windsor is across the river, the St. Clair River from Detroit. And fortunately, what happened was it drifted out onto the gravel, and as soon as the truck hit the gravel, I woke up. So, kind of mostly on highways and interstates. To prevent that very thing is, people that fall asleep on the highway or along the freeway and wake them up. So that was the first time that I fell asleep. The second time I fell asleep was a little more dangerous, coming down over the snow squall, and we passed, 70 miles an hour, middle of the night in snow, and I don't know, probably my guardian angels woke me up coming down the hill, and there's a snowplow, and I'm just like right behind the snowplow, and just like all of a sudden just like woke up. And so that was the second time. And the third time I fell asleep in the truck was not in the truck, but after doing a run down to Indianapolis and back, and I'd been really pushing it, was probably a 15, 16, even 18-hour run, and I'd been up for the better part of a day by the time I started driving home. And same thing, fell asleep at the wheel and off into the gravel in my car, and woke up, and again, driving tired. So managing fatigue, and as I said, there's a video here on the channel that will give you some tips and techniques about driving tired and staying awake, and how to stay awake so that you're safe. But really, in the end, the only way that you can do that is by getting some sleep. And for commercial drivers, wheelmen will tell you the same thing. Anybody who's driving commercially, whether it's a car, it's a bus, a van, whatever it is, you need to manage your fatigue. And years later, when I was driving single, even getting 20 minutes sleep will help you to carry on and be safe. And that's why I don't recommend people driving team, because as I said, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 4 hours on, you're kind of a machine. And whereas when you're driving single, you can just climb in the bunk for 20 minutes or half an hour, maybe even an hour or 2 hours, and carry on with your drive and be safe for that. And the next time I came up against that, in terms of trying to manage fatigue, when I was driving bus coaches for Greyhound, and driving overnight between Melbourne and Sydney for 10 hours, 12 hours in the bus, and having to keep according to a schedule. And I can remember how difficult that was when I first started driving buses, and I had to be at certain places at certain times, and just like nodding, especially the other thing about driving a bus and trying to stay awake on a bus is there's 50 snoring people behind you, and so they're all sleeping, and you have to stay awake to drive the bus. And I can remember stopping in rest areas and out and running around the bus and trying to keep going, and trying to eat rice cakes and those types of things while I was driving the bus to try and stay awake. Sometimes some of the passengers would stay awake, but it was pretty challenging driving the bus until I sort of became acclimatized to all of that. Carrie said, even when driving tired, it does not seem like one drives as well. No, you don't drive as well. Your reflexes are slower. You're not, you're just not as aware. You're not as alert, and it's difficult. And in a big truck, when you're driving a big truck and you have a non-synchronous transmission, I mean, as soon as you start grinding the gears, most of the time you're tired. And for me, when I was really pushing it, and there was times I was really pushing it, for me, I knew that as soon as I started chewing my fingernails, I had 10 minutes to get off the road. It was that dire. When I started chewing my fingernails, I had 10 minutes to get off the road, or otherwise I would just fall asleep at the wheel. So those were some of the mistakes that I made. Falling asleep, brake lines. When the summer I got my license, I had the truck parked there, and I hooked it up to the trailer, and I couldn't get the trailer brakes to release. and I reversed the service line and the emergency line, so the red and the blue on the back of the trailer, and I called a mechanic out, which was crazy, and they reversed the lines, and away I went, and of course they just shook their head, and they're just like, oh, you're in it, you're a goof. But it was a rookie mistake. But, you know, that rookie mistake has been fixed too, because now the glad hands are polarized, so you can't hook up the trailer lines incorrectly. So, hi. Hello from New York. Actually, I think I've driven through the thumbnail of the video, just don't remember where it is. Actually, I think that's a picture of the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway there. Ben, I wanted to say thank you. Your YouTube video is really helping me so far. I was to take my driving exam March 30, but was canceled because of the coronavirus. Please, I will need your advice. It'll be rescheduled, Ben, definitely, and they're going to have to take care of the backlog for those of you who were canceled and postponed in terms of the virus and doing road tests and whatnot. So, a couple other mistakes I made. You know, I talked about the story where we got lost in northern Ontario and backed the trailer down into a logging road and pulled a couple of the I-beams out because basically what happened was is when it backed down in, the trailer twisted like this, and the trailer sat down on the tandems on the wheels on the back of the tractor, and that's what tore the I-beams out on the subframe out on the bottom of the trailer. So there was that mistake. I lost it on a hill. You know, and most rookie drivers do this. If you don't get any training in terms of shifting on hills, you know, because a lot of places, Ontario, Manitoba, the prairies, you know, Montana, lots of places in the U.S., up and down the eastern seaboard, I mean, unless you're in Kentucky or Virginia or those types of places, they simply don't have hills. And as somebody was saying the other day, a lot of these trucking schools just teach you in an empty truck. They don't even have a load on the truck. So, you know, students are not prepared when they go out, and unfortunately this mandatory entry-level training is not fixing that problem. It is not making drivers, truck drivers and bus drivers more safe on our roadways. It's simply not doing that, because you cannot teach the truck driver to be more safe in a classroom. You cannot teach them to be more safe in the yard. They got to be in the truck driving the truck. All right, so Farron's here from South Africa. She made it. Wheelman, do tandem drives have lower rear ratios, numerically higher than singles? Europe is mainly single drive. Wheelman, it depends on what Wheelman's talking about is different gear ratios in the rear ends of the trucks. And it depends on the type of work that the truck is going to be doing on how they gear the back of the truck. So, for example, here in the mountains, in BC, they really love their Super Bs. These are the big trucks that are running out at 140,000 pounds up and down the mountains. Those trucks are going to be geared lower so that they have more pulling power going up and down over the mountains. And then other trucks, for example, are going to be running up and down the West Coast. They're not going to be running hills and those types of things. So the rear ends are going to be geared higher for better fuel economy. So, for example, the trucks that we ran, when we were running team back and forth between Toronto and Vancouver, I mean, it was only a short stint over the mountains compared to the rest of the trip. So the rear ends were geared a lot higher so that the engine ran at a lower RPM when you were going down the highway at 65 miles an hour on cruise control. So the bottom line was to get better fuel economy. Now, some of these other trucks that are running vocational, for example, they're running logging trucks, or they're running dump trucks, gravel trucks, those types of things. Those are vocational trucks. Those are going to be geared really low for getting in and out of gravel pits, for getting in and out of the bush, running off-road and whatnot. So it's going to depend on what work the truck is going to be doing as to how the rear ends are set up on it in terms of gearing and whatnot. And that's kind of a technical thing. But anyway, so what else did I need to... Oh, and one of the biggest mistakes I made that almost caused a crash when I was driving was I was coming out of a truck stop one night and made a left-hand turn out onto the highway. And one of the transitions that you kind of got to get used to when you're driving trucks and trailers is turns, and how much more time it takes to make that turn in a tractor trailer, especially on a highway where traffic is thundering by at 50, 65, 70 miles an hour. You need a huge gap in a tractor trailer because it takes a lot of time to get a loaded tractor trailer from 0 up to 50, 60 miles an hour. Like in some cases, it can take up 2, 3, 4 minutes. And that's a huge gap. And one of the mistakes I made one night was I pulled out without sufficient gap. And fortunately, you know, the other traffic kind of moved around me and those types of things. But I remember the other truck drivers on the CB radio cussing me out and saying that the ride was a lot softer after that because I scared the living bejesus out of them. So we talked about running team for a few months, and then I went to work for a company in the United States, Burlington Motor Carriers, and basically learned after a few months that basically what the Canadian drivers were hired to do was to go and load the trailers in Toronto, pull them into Detroit, Michigan, and then the American drivers would come and get the load and take it wherever it needed to go in the United States. And wasn't making a whole lot of money because you're getting paid by the mile, and you're not getting paid to load the trailer. You're not getting paid to weigh the trailer. You're not getting any money to bring the trailer across the border, and that takes time. That can take an hour to 4 hours, depending on, you know, whether you just go across the border or, you know, and you have what was called a PARS, which is just basically a grocery store, you know, scan that they scan it, or you have to go inside. You have to actually go into customs to clear the border. So then after that, I got a job working for a personnel agency. And a personnel agency, for those of you going into the industry, might be another place that you potentially could get a job as a CDL truck driver. Go to a personnel agency. These are companies or agencies that hire drivers, and then they outsource them out to the industry. And so you could go to work for any number of companies and whatnot. So Lightning, since trucks are made to carry heavy loads, instructors should teach people both with and without loads, especially if it's manual, because weight will affect the transmission, especially uphill. And there's no doubt about that, Farron. And it's a lot more difficult in a tractor trailer unit because it's a non-synchronous transmission. It's not like a transmission in a car at all. It's, you know, in order to shift a non-synchronous transmission, and for those of you who are interested, I have a video on shifting theory, and it's basically explaining to you that to shift a non-synchronous transmission, 3 things have to line up: the road speed, the engine speed, and the gear. If those 3 things don't match, that thing is not going to go into gear. It doesn't matter. It's just it's like a woman scorned. It will not go into gear, no matter what you do or how much you pray. It's not going to go into gear. So that's what a non-synchronous transmission is, and it's a bit daunting for new drivers. All right, Michael, my friend, how are you? Epic is here. Like your story, Rick. For some out-of-state commercial drivers like New Jersey, base driving in New York State, some do unfortunately hit the overpass in New York City due to the low bridge clearances. Yes, and we'll talk briefly about that as well. That's the other thing about learning how to drive trucks and buses is that now it's not just width and length. It's also height. You have to be looking up. You have to figure out what the height of your unit is. And fortunately, I never hit anything overhead. A few bumps and scrapes for the most part. But this is one of the pieces that I tell new drivers is you got to look up. You got to pay attention to those overhead signs. There's another video here on the channel that goes over overhead obstructions. And in Canada, 4.15 meters. In the United States... In the United States, 13 feet 6 inches. And if it's not 13 feet 6 inches, do not try and go under it, because you will take the front off the trailer. And I've seen a few other guys who have done this in their time, taking the front off the trailer. Okay, so Lightning, do trucking companies provide you money to pay for gas, or do you have to pay for it? No. Lightning, if you are a driver working for the company, you do get a fuel card, and the company puts the fuel in it. Now, only if you own your own truck do you have to put fuel in these trucks. And this is another thing about that, you know, nobody ever seems to get very excited about how terrible the fuel economy is on these trucks. You know, even 3 years ago when I went to drive another truck, you know, I used to think, oh my God, they've got to be getting these trucks up to 10 miles to the gallon. These trucks are still getting 6.5, 7 miles to the gallon at best. And that's on a highway truck. Most of these trucks that are running really heavy, and maybe Wheelman, you can tell me what kind of fuel economy you get there in Portugal. I know it's probably going to be in liters per 100 gallon. But here in North America, I mean, most of these trucks get 6.5, 7 miles to the gallon, if that. And So, most of these trucks, when I was driving 4 years ago, 1,000 liters to fill the truck up. 1,000 liters cost you about, $1,200 to fill it up, and you need to fill it up, every 3 or 4 days, depending on how much you're running, how much you're working. So they take a lot of fuel. Okay, Wheelman, thank you. I really like the technical details, the new engines designed for down speeding, direct versus overdrive with these ratios in mind. Not much info on YouTube concerning drive axles. No, there's not not a lot. It's Wheelman. It's not something that's very sexy and going to get a lot of views for most people. So it's very specific information. All right, so I went to work for the personnel agency and did some of this work, and I told you the other day, I mean, there's two kinds of truck drivers. There's those truck drivers that have 20 years experience but only have 1 year experience because they work for the same company, driving the same truck, doing the same run day in and day out and day in and day out. And then there's other truck drivers who have 1 year experience, who have 20 years actual driving experience, and that was me. Because I went to work for a personnel agency, and I was the guy that worked for the personnel agency, and they would just send me out to different companies. I would drive different tractors, different trailers all the time. I mean, it was not uncommon for me to be called at 6 o'clock at night and say, listen, we have a run for you to Chicago. We need you to be there in the morning at 10 o'clock. Here's the address of the company. Here's your truck number, here's your trailer number, and you go down the building on the back side. On the second door on the right is the driver's room. You go in there, and in locker number 8 is the paperwork that you need for the truck and trailer to get across the border into the United States. And that's what I did for quite some time. So I never drove the same tractor, never drove the same trailer, or never pulled the same trailer all the time. Always different trailers, different loads, different destinations. And, this was also in the day, as I said before, when I drove truck in the 90s, before GPS and before phones and those types of things. I mean, this was all done with map books and pay phones and calling the shipper and whatnot and getting directions to where you were going. And so eventually, after working for this personnel agency for a while and moving around to different companies and whatnot, I finally landed a job full-time, more or less, with a company called MacArthur Express. And MacArthur Express was based out of Cambridge, Ontario. They were running office furniture for Steelcase, and they kind of hit the mother lode, so to speak. Steelcase was incredibly busy in the early 1990s, selling office furniture throughout the United States. And, it was a great job. I can remember that one of my first runs with them, I went down and they sent me, one of the drivers called in sick, and they sent me down the Eastern Seaboard. And, I just kind of thought about it because most of the companies in the early 1990s were paying kind of like 28, 30 cents a mile to run into the States. And you could make a fairly decent living at 30 cents a mile. If you were running good, running 10,000 miles a month, you were making $3,000 or $4,000 a month, which was a decent wage. And so, I didn't really think of anything about it. I didn't ask any questions about going to work for this company. And, went in, did the run, and it was LTL freight too, which is, LTL stands for less than load, which simply means you have 6 or 8 drops on a trailer. And that was basically it, 6 or 8 drops on a trailer. Went down and, I think the run went into New Jersey, it went into Pennsylvania, into Philadelphia, and then I ended up in West Virginia. And what happened in West Virginia was that it snowed in West Virginia, and they basically shut the state down. And I ended up sitting there all weekend. They laid me over for the weekend because the place that my last drop that I was supposed to deliver at wasn't open. So I got on the phone with dispatch and they said, oh, well, we'll just lay you over for the weekend. I said, okay, I don't mind. And didn't really think about it. It was normal, typical trucking, going to be laid over for the weekend. I had to wait till Monday. And that was interesting, being laid over in West Virginia. This was kind of one of my first experiences of really kind of being in the deep south kind of thing. And on the Saturday, of the 2 days I was being laid over, I walked into town from the truck stop, and it was, probably 3 miles into town. And there, it was my first real experience with American culture, kind of away from the Canadian border or away from metropolitan cities. And it was a small town. It probably wasn't very big, probably 2,000 or 3,000 people. And, I went in to like a coffee shop, typical clapboard, orange crust sign out the front of this white clapboard house or coffee shop place. Got kind of talking people up, and there was a young black American kid in there, African American, I think is the proper term. And he was asking me some questions. He was pretty enamored with who I was and where I came from. Wanted to know where I was from, and I said, "Oh, I'm from Canada." And I was trying to explain to him where Canada was, or where I lived in Canada. And I didn't have any success because this young kid didn't even know where Michigan was, or any of the other states outside of West Virginia. So it was a failed enterprise in trying to explain to him where I was. But anyway, I started walking back to the truck, and there wasn't anybody in any American city, even then and or after that places that I visited, if I was out walking around, there wasn't anybody else walking around. Americans don't walk around for the most part. I mean, it's not like when you see pictures of New York City and you see everybody walking. In most rural, backwater towns and those types of places, people in the United States simply don't walk. They drive everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And the other interesting thing about the South that I learned later on is that, some of these people in Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi and places like that, they will live in these absolute shacks, but they'll have a $60,000 or $70,000 jacked up 4-wheel drive pickup truck sitting in the driveway, and that they'll drive to work because people don't see their homes. People don't come to their homes, but people see them driving around in the truck. And it was similar to this place that I stayed over on the 2 days. And actually, I don't know, I got talking to somebody. I must have been talking to somebody. And they insisted that I not walk back to the truck stop. They insisted giving me a ride in this dilapidated piece of junk car that if I remember correctly, it had holes in the floor. And the exhaust was coming up through by the time I got back to the truck stop, I was almost asphyxiated because of the exhaust coming up through the floor of this car. And so it's laid over for the weekend, finally got delivered on Monday. I think I picked up another load coming back. And, I was gone for a week on this first run with MacArthur Express, and came back and then finally got my paycheck. And there was, all of the money I got paid per the mile. And then there was money for running into New York State and running over the bridge. I think I must have gone into Brooklyn at that point. And there was a bonus. There was a $200 bonus for running into New York City. There was also, money for being laid over. There was $150 a day for being laid over, which was completely beyond me. I'd heard about it, but I'd never heard people that got paid for being laid over. I got $150 a day. Plus, after the first drop, I think I was making $50 a drop. And, for me, for 7 days of work, I made $1,200, which was considerably more money than I'd ever made before. And I was just like, yeah, this is this is the place I want to work. This is the place I'm going to actually make some money. And I did make a lot of money working for the personnel agency and working for MacArthur Express. And I stayed there for a couple of years. But it was interesting that, I became the runner at MacArthur Express. I was the guy that, if you wanted somebody to run 1,000 miles in a day, I was that guy. I would just run that truck stupid. Not safe? No, definitely not safe. But, this was the days before I started teaching safety. So, yeah, tougher work. Some of the places, what did Epic say here? Speaking of trucking in New York State, some roads allow road trains, 248-foot trailers commonly seen on interstates. Throughway does not. Driving a road train different from 53-foot trailers. Basically, Epic talking about road trains, which is basically 253-foot trailers on the back of a tractor. They've done these in terms of volume. They work as long as they're just going straight up and down the interstate. They don't work off the interstate. Okay, they basically pull off the interstate. They go into a staging area. They separate the two trailers, and another one comes in. Now, pulling a 53-foot trailer. And Epic, I hate to say it, but there's not a lot of skill in that. You're basically driving straight down the road. You're not manipulating that truck in through an urban area. It's not like a road tractor with a 53-foot trailer on it that's 75 feet long and trying to get that through New York City. And this is the other point that I wanted to make about driving in large metropolitan cities and pulling office furniture for Steelcase was most of the time when you're hauling general freight in a truck, you end up in the industrial areas on the outskirts of town that are just off the interstate. So you're not driving into town. When I delivered office furniture for Steelcase and worked for this company, or drivers that worked for Steelcase, you end up downtown. I ended up in Manhattan. I end up in lower Manhattan, in Brooklyn. I ended up at, trying to think. I want to say Dale Carnegie, the Carnegie Library in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Somebody might be able to correct me on that. But, at the library, we were delivering office furniture to the library, and that's where we ended up with a crew. So most of the time, and it was the same thing with Boston. I went into Boston, went into Philadelphia. You went downtown with this truck because that's where the office furniture was going. It wasn't going to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Jaden, apologize I don't talk for the rest of the stream because I'm really mad at my sister right now. That's all good, Jaden. As long as it doesn't descend into physical violence, as my two kids it sometimes does. Farron, what was the largest and smallest thing you've towed thus far, if you remember? Probably the largest thing, Farron, that I towed was garbage trailers out of Toronto, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later, but 6-axle garbage trailers. 100 and... what the heck was that? 135,000 pounds. Toronto, Ontario filled up its landfills and was shipping all of its garbage into Michigan. And yeah, so that happened for a while, and those were pretty big loads. The other thing I did, Farron, was I pulled, it was this company on Vancouver Island. They made these huge pieces of equipment and then floated them over to Vancouver Island, over to the mainland rather, and had a huge piece of equipment that was oversized, over length, those kinds of things. But I only moved it a couple of blocks, and that was rather challenging. But I had a huge crew around me and those types of things, and oversized loads. I mean, there are some pretty crazy stuff that gets moved on roadways, and you can see some of that on YouTube here on some of those huge videos where they're moving just massive amounts of pieces. Lightning, Brooklyn sounds like a cool place because it's called Brooklyn. Yes, it is. Wheelman, driving in New York must be very challenging. Madrid sure is. Yeah, it can be challenging in New York. Definitely is. One time that I drove in New York, I was going to Long Island City. Long Island, as you know, is a long island that goes east of Manhattan. You got to go across the river and then get out onto Long Island, and it's probably 100 miles. Maybe somebody in the States can correct me on that about how far it is. But got down there, and I was going to Long Island City, so I go up on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway and get out on the Long Island Expressway. And I thought to myself, well, I'll just see the sign that'll say Long Island City, and I'll just get off, and I'll call the shipper, or the person receiving the load, and away we go. So I get on Long Island Expressway, and I'm heading out there, and I'm going mile marker 10, mile marker 20, mile marker 30. I'm 30 miles out, no sign. Nothing saying Long Island City. And you have to realize you're in a big truck. By the time I got out there, I kind of got out to about mile 40. So you're out almost, 40, 45 minutes driving out on Long Island Expressway. And I finally got onto the CB radio, and I said to the other drivers, I said, okay, is there anybody who knows where Long Island City is? And finally, after a couple of tries, because CBs are very unreliable in terms of getting directions from other drivers and whatnot, one of the drivers comes back on. He says, oh, Long Island City. He says, Long Island City's back at mile marker 3. And when you go north on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway out of Brooklyn and you turn onto the Long Island Expressway, there's about 3 or 4 miles on the west side of Brooklyn-Queens Expressway just before you go over or under the river to go to Manhattan. But I didn't know this. And so I was out on mile marker 45 before I got the truck turned around and heading back to Long Island City. That is really in Queens. It's in the borough of Queens. Long Island City is not on Long Island. And these are the things that you learn, and, before we had maps and access to GPS and whatnot. So by the time I got done, I was an hour and a half late of where I was supposed to be because I went out 45 miles and had to come back 45 miles, which is 90 miles. And, got kind of crazy. Ranju, now I can't drive anywhere because of the lockdown imposed. Yes, and a lot of people are having the same problem, Ranju. I don't think my vehicle has moved in almost 3 weeks. And somebody said that on Facebook yesterday. It was actually pretty funny. Somebody said having low fuel costs during lockdown is like giving a bald man a hairbrush. Like me, giving me a hairbrush. It's pointless. It's pointless. It's just one of those things you can't have. Zachary, my friend, how are you? So, I'll just leave you with a little bit of a last story here in terms of working for MacArthur Express. One of the things that I learned about MacArthur Express very quickly, it was run by a guy named Walter, and Walter was a tyrant. He was an absolute tyrant. And I remember the first time that happened that you went in to the back of the warehouse to get your paperwork and your load and those types of things, and the office staff was kind of in behind this glass room. Well, one of the other drivers went in to where all the office staff was sitting and the dispatch and those types of things, and I thought, oh, okay, well, it's kind of an open policy, and everybody gets along here. And so I went in, and Walter comes up to me and he goes, "You go out there," in this very stern, kind of miserable, old coot voice. And I was like, oh, that's how it works. Yes, men. And I learned very quickly that working for MacArthur Express had its yes men. The yes men got to drive the Peterbilts, and all the rest of the drivers, they drove Freightliners and Internationals. And I was not a yes man. I did not get a Peterbilt. I got an International. So Lightning says, yes, what a waste in terms of fuel prices. Epic. Rick, it's 120 miles from North Fork Orient Point to Queens Midtown Tunnel Portal. Yes, so there you go. So I was close. It's 120 miles from one end of Long Island to the other end of Long Island. I-49 Long Island Expressway lacks mile markers due to a late 1990s to a 2005 rebuild to add high occupancy lanes. Oh, so they don't have mile markers anymore. Interesting. Farron, reminder, notice there is a person named Tom who comments on every YouTube video. He is a spam account, total spam. He will comment on the video saying great content or something like that. How do you know that, Farron? And I mean, if he's just saying great comment, I mean, how is he spamming me? Okay, I don't know. I'm just asking. Zachary, you're good. How are you doing today? I hope you and everyone is staying safe. Yes, we're all good. We're all safe. And the other awesome thing about it is that it's supposed to go up to 19 degrees Celsius here. That's 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Oh my God, the sun is out. They just go out on the back deck. It is just absolutely magic. Oh my God, spring is here. Spring is here. All right, so that's where we're at. I'll talk more about driving in New York City because I got some great stories about driving in New York City. One of the things that I learned about driving in New York City is that when I first started going down to New York City, I had to go across the Manhattan Bridge. The Manhattan Bridge? No, sorry, the George Washington Bridge. So I had to go across the George Washington Bridge. And for the first 3 or 4 times that I went down there, I was talking to one of the other drivers, and they said, you just go across the Manhattan Bridge. And I was going into Manhattan. I was delivering in Manhattan. I had to get on Broadway. And so I'm going across the bridge, and I missed it. I missed the exit, those types of things. And this is what the guys kept saying to me. Well, it's the first exit off the bridge. Okay, so it's first exit off the bridge. And I think it was the 5th time that I'm coming across the GW Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, and I realized that it wasn't off the bridge. It wasn't the next exit after the bridge. The flippin' exit to get into Manhattan, to get onto Broadway, was still on the bridge. Yet you weren't even finished getting across the bridge. It was like you didn't even get to the end of the bridge, and there's the exit off Manhattan to get down into Broadway. And it took me 4 or 5 times before I kind of clued into this and wasn't, driving up in the middle of somewhere else and trying to get the truck turned around and come back to get off into New York. So, yeah. Hall phase, yes, I've driven in Boston too. And Boston, the circle inside of the circle, which is the old part of Boston, is way more challenging than driving in Manhattan, because the nice thing about driving in Manhattan is it's on a grid. So, avenues go north-south, and then streets go east-west. I believe I might have that right. Epic might be able to correct me on that. Farron, because he is on every single video on every single channel, not just this one, he was on all my videos and so many other people's videos saying the exact same thing. Oh, okay. I just, Farron, I just wonder what is the purpose of that, of just going on random videos and just saying nice content, that sort of thing. Seems weird. Anyway, you know, hopefully he's boosting my channel a little bit, because like I said, it's on life support right now. This is part of life support. So, yeah, so we'll talk about Boston. Okay, customs officers. Yes, learned a lot about customs officers, and learned a little bit about, you know, people who are hired to be customs officials and carrying guns and those types of things. Okay, Tom's videos are filled with videos on how to spam and get videos. Okay, another interesting bit in the world of YouTube and putting videos and those types of things. So, all right, so beautiful day out. Hope you guys are enjoying weather. Like I said, I'm going to talk more about New York City tomorrow, running truck into New York City. I did run New York for 6 months, and then I got pulled off New York City because what happened was Walter, who I told you, who ran the company, the MacArthur Express, was a bit of a tyrant. Wanted to know one day why it took me 2 hours to drive from Long Island. I was on Long Island. It was 60 miles. He wanted to know why it took me 2 hours to drive 60 miles from Long Island out to Scottsdale, New Jersey. I remember that specifically, giving me a hard time about why it took me 2 hours and in a tractor trailer. And you know, you got to go through Brooklyn, across the bridge, onto Staten Island, across the bridge, the Verrazano Bridge, I think it's called, and into Jersey, and then find the place that you're looking for in New Jersey. And wanted to know why it took me 2 hours. And I was not very pleasant when I told him why it took me 2 hours. Actually, I think there might have been some profanity as well when I was on the phone with him. He was just, you know, he was a tyrant. Not only was he a tyrant, but he was ignorant, and he was not very smart. He knew nothing about trucking, because he was not a truck driver. He was a business owner, and wanted loads delivered and those types of things. And a lot of what Steelcase was doing in terms of when they were outsourcing the work to other truck companies were very demanding in terms of getting drivers at certain places and certain times and whatnot. So, Ben, have I been to Paris to drive? No, I haven't been yet. And unfortunately, the coronavirus here put some of all of this on hold. I did have a trip booked. I actually had 2 trips booked. I had one trip to London. I was supposed to go to London this month, and then I was supposed to go to New York City at the beginning of May, and both of those trips unfortunately got postponed. So we'll get there, and Paris is definitely on my list. Lightning Farron, there was a bit of a fight there. Thanks, Carrie, so much, and thank you, everybody. If you got any questions about road tests, all of that sort of thing, we're more than happy to help you out. Everybody stay safe, and remember, pick the best answer, not necessarily the right answer. Have a great day. Bye now.